what did you have for breakfast today?
I had muesli.
Muesli?
That I make myself.
It's a common theme amongst a lot of guests. Muesli?
Yes.
How do you have it with yogurt, standard milk?
No. I'm on a vegan diet, so I have lots of seeds, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds.
Almond milk, rice milk?
Bit of hemp, soy.
Soy, okay.
Soy.
This podcast is brought to you by Neural Media. Are you an entrepreneur or maybe a marketer who wants to grow their business through content production? Maybe you're sick of dealing with agencies or want an outsourced solution that actually fits a budget? Well, Neural Media, our business, can help you with simple and affordable content production, saving you time and money by taking away that pain of producing the content. If you want to learn more, just head to neural.com/media, which is NEURALLE.com/media. Play around with our pricing, have a look at all the different options that you have, request or consider requesting a callback from me personally. If you have a friend that runs a business or is a marketer, do send them our way. It will help us keep the lights on and producing more juicy content. Listeners to this show receive a special discount by using the promo code UNCOMMON. If you want to learn yourself as to how to create content, maybe you want to make a podcast or your very own video, just download our free series on how to create a podcast and video at the very bottom of neural.com/media. Welcome to Uncommon, the podcast that helps you build your knowledge, skills, and mindset through interviews with unique individuals. My name is Jordan Michaelides, the CEO of Neural Media and your host. In this episode, we have for you Gail Pascoe. Gail is a writer, presenter, and facilitator in the field of donor conception and IVF. Her knowledge and experience as an individual who conceived a daughter with donor sperm, of whom shares a donor with over 100 siblings, is truly fascinating. The field of IVF has greatly expanded here in Australia in the last decade, while older age pregnancies are becoming more and more common. And there was a recent Four Corners on the ABC documentary, which piqued my interest in this space. And it was, I guess, fortuitous that the timing came that Eileen introduced someone to me, and hence that was Gail over email. And here we are. And I think that Gail's nous in many of the moral questions in this space allows us to consider what the future of conception and childbearing may hold in Australia. This was an insightful discussion where we covered why Gail chose donor conception, the donor process and IVF, learning from pregnancy, sperm banks and the morality questions that so often surround this space, connecting with your donor and how that's sort of similar to dating people on Tinder and choosing your donor in that way. And then some funny, bizarre donor stories at the end as well. So I think this will be very enjoyable for anyone who likes our previous discussions in, the medical field. If you want something similar, then check out our chat with Hon Weng Chong, episode 98, where we spoke about neural computing, as well as having a look at Eileen's episode. That was episode 76, Gail's friend, where she spoke about the dark web. If you like this, do subscribe on your podcast app. That'll help us and go a very long way. And consider leaving us a rating as well. We'd much appreciate that. If you want the show notes, just head to our index. That's neural.com/podcast, NEURALLE.com/podcast. But as I say each week, thanks for listening. Our regulars, thank you so much for coming back. Our newbies, thanks for giving us this shot. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Gail Pascoe. Thank you for joining me after our little escapade of finding car parks and whatnot, Gail. I'm very glad to have you in finally. I've like I was saying over email, and I think you probably saw in my notes, is a very interesting areas for me that I didn't think I'd be researching at all and having someone on to discuss. But thanks so much for coming in.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, the interesting thing I like to do, particularly when I'm interviewing a guest and they know a former guest, or there might be an introduction some way, is what's an icebreaker I can use to get them to chill out and relax when they first come in. And the first thing I was looking at was your skydiving career with Eileen, and I was thinking, when your daughter is of age and able to do such things, will you let her do that now in hindsight?
Absolutely not. She would never go for a skydive.
How did you get into that?
I'd just been dumped by a boyfriend.
Okay.
Who I thought was, we were going to get married and have their white picket fence and 2.4 kids or whatever it is. And a girlfriend said, let's go skydiving. And I said, no way, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Most stupidest thing ever. And then I thought, I was in a pretty bad way. And I said, all right, let's do it. I don't care if I die, in a very kind of tragic victim sort of way. And we went and did it, and I landed on the ground and went, oh, wow, I want to do that again. I want to do it every weekend. So
I like that. It's one of those things I was discussing with my partner the other night that I'm not sure that I'll ever want. I don't know why, but it's one of those things I don't want to do. It's just, it scares the absolute shit out of me. But yeah, it's quite funny. After doing that, I got a bit sidetracked researching skydiving on YouTube for a good hour. But it was very interesting to look back at that. Now, before we continue, I might actually just turn this aircon down because I can actually hear it in the background. So give me 1 sec.
Sure.
Still all recording, so they can cut out. Now, going back to your daughter and children, and I was thinking about your own childhood, what's sort of the earliest memory that you have of your own childhood?
I can remember a couple of times at kinder, which were a bit not really that interesting, a bit of apples and lemons and milk, but there was one memory that comes to mind. And that was when I was in prep. So I started early. They started kids early back then, showing my age here, 4.5. And I remember playing Kiss Chasey.
Kiss Chasey.
And the punishment was to get dragged into the boys' toilets if you got caught by a boy.
Really?
And
he had to kiss you?
Yeah, they had to kiss me. So I remember very clearly being dragged into the boys' toilets and this stench of those, I don't know what they call them.
Oh, they're horrible. Yeah.
It was foul.
Yeah.
It was a really
And that was
strong
your
memory.
first experience?
And then the headmaster busted us, so he came marching down the corridor, and I remember his black shiny shoes, and he was very authoritarian, not a very nice human being, and he dragged us into his office and stood with us. We stood facing him, and he grabbed our heads together and he smashed them together, and he said, "Yeah, that should knock some sense into you."
Wow.
So that was my first experience of violence.
But that's also interesting, that smell, like, that you were talking about. I can imagine having not been in a male bathroom before, that thing is, yeah.
Cemented in my memory.
Yeah. I don't know that you find many bathrooms like that anymore. They have those, what do you call those things? They're like urinal cakes or something.
Toilet lolly, somebody told me.
Toilet lolly. That's what I meant, yeah. I remember the first time learning about it and thinking, what, you can eat them? And my dad was like, no. That's so funny. What did you think you were going to be when you were a kid? Like, what did you think your job was going to be when you're older?
I had a lot of different occupations that I was going to be. The biggest one was probably a vet, because I loved animals.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were you really set on that for a long period of time?
No. I remember from my early days in primary school. When I was older, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do.
Okay.
Throughout the entire high school, no idea.
Really? Yeah, that was interesting to me, because I was looking at your career. You've had a few different ones. You were teaching secondary PE in Melbourne and London. You were doing instructional design for a while as well. And then you got into the writing field of things. So how did sort of that all work? Like, how did you fall into teaching? Because instructional design sort of seems like an element of teaching as well. How did you fall into that, or how did that come about as you were sort of finishing up at high school?
Yeah, well, I was reflecting on our careers advice at school, which was pretty absent. I remember there was a mounted policewoman that came, and I thought, that looks cool.
Yeah.
'Cause I like horses.
Okay.
I'd be a terrible policewoman though.
Yeah.
And then there was somebody else came and presented something on commerce. I didn't even know what that was. I'm more a humanities person, and something else which I couldn't remember. And so when it came to selecting university, I knew I wanted to go to university. When it came to selecting something, I thought, PE teacher, I can be outdoors, I was into sports myself. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I just kind of fell into it.
Yeah. And then you went away, I'm guessing you taught in London and then you travelled after that?
Yeah, London was a base. So I did teaching there.
Yeah.
What do they call it there? Not emergency teaching, effectively. And I would just earn some cash and then go off and do something else and come back.
Yeah, a lot of Aussies do that, I think. I had my 10-year reunion, when was it? Like late last year. And I think something like 30% or 25% of the year level was working in the UK.
Right.
And that's one of those common things is you do a gap year and you become a PE teacher, like a grammar school, like like at a boarding school of some kind, because then you got your lodgings, your food, everything paid for. And then you can just live your life wherever you are or wherever you're living at that time. Okay. And so you traveled for quite a lot of time. That was interesting to me because I know that I had a period of like 6-7 months traveling through Europe with my partner, maybe a year after I left uni. But 3 years, that's quite a long time. So were you back and forth between the jobs and traveling at all?
I only came back once.
Okay.
I just wanted to check in, make sure everything was still okay. But I came home with the intent of going back again. I bought a return ticket to go back. But
you did Central America, Asia and Europe. Do you have a particular affinity to any place at all?
Not really. I had a bit of a love-hate relationship with London.
Why is that?
Well, despite there being millions of people living there, it can be an incredibly lonely place because everyone's got their blinkers on and going about their thing. But I lived in one of those horrible houses with about 20 other Australians and Kiwis, and one guy lived in the garden shed.
Oh my God.
He had the best space in the house though, because he had his own room. Everybody else shared. I think with Dossers in the lounge room.
20 people?
I think it was about 5 bedrooms.
Wow. So it's like being in a backpackers, in a way.
Except much more feral.
Yeah, really.
But fun. It was good.
What did you learn from that period of time in your life during that travel period?
Definitely independence. I was one of those kids growing up that was very much the pleaser. Very quiet, stayed under the radar, never wanted to get into trouble with a good girl. So over there, I remember sitting on a drop zone one day, looking up at the sky. I was in England and all these people were jumping out of the plane. I was on a load coming up and thinking, I can do anything I want and nobody will know.
And you were travelling on your own as well, right?
I initially went with a friend and we travelled around. He had relatives in South Yorkshire.
Okay.
So we went and stayed with his family for a while, and it took me about 3 weeks to actually understand anything they were saying.
That's so funny. My fiance's mum's family's from Yorkshire as well. It's that all love.
Going down pub.
Going down pub.
You missed a word.
Which city in South Yorkshire? Or what town, I guess?
Just a little Kilnhurst, Rotherham.
Yeah. So right, okay. Because we went to York, and their family's beautiful. In Leeds as well. So we went by Leeds, but I really like the Yorkshire Dales. Is amazing.
I was blown away by the countryside in the UK. I just thought it was stunning.
Well, it's underrated. I feel like a lot of people go to the UK and they're just like, London or Edinburgh. And Edinburgh is still quite an amazing city, but I feel like Edinburgh gives you a sample for what the countryside can be, Yeah. And it's so lush. It's so green.
Yes.
It's so, I don't know, like it just seems weird for us, maybe as Australians, that you can go, from one city and then be in like the middle of nowhere like you would sort of in rural Victoria, and then bang, you're in another major city as well. Like it's so, because England is so compact and so small. I think it's like the size of Victoria or something like that. That always blew my mind, being able to travel around so easily like that.
Yeah, it's a great place.
Now, obviously you saw my notes. You got into this instructional design space. What intrigued you by that? Like, why get into this area?
I think I always had a penchant for writing.
Okay.
And in fact, I was moving house a little while ago, a couple of years ago, and I discovered a book that I'd written in grade 6. And it was a murder novel. And I thought, oh, yeah, okay, this has always been in me, but I've always been influenced by people saying, oh, you know, that profession's really hard to get into. And okay, I won't try it. You know, and it's taken me a few decades to work out that not to pay attention to any of that and follow your passion. So when I kind of fell into a role when I came back from overseas, I applied for about 25 teaching jobs, didn't even get an interview with any of them. So I fell into a role at Telstra answering the phones for it was supposed to be 6 weeks, and ended up staying there for 10 years. And I remember that very first week in the training room, this woman was training us and I thought, I could do that. So I stuck around and then I got a training role, a facilitation role, and then I was really driven to do the writing part of it. So the designing and developing training material was my next thing. Yeah,
that's interesting. I'm trying to understand, you know, because people may look at that and go, oh, why would she want to do that? But then I'm starting to see parts of your personality that, you know, like when you were talking on the blog, there's a component you talk about being very thorough. I think I've got this in my notes. And I wonder like how much of the enjoyment you got from that is not creating the instructions per se, but making sure everything was thoroughly correct. I
think you might have hit the nail on the head there.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm very detailed, and that can sometimes be great.
Yes.
Depending on what I'm doing, and sometimes it can hold me back, and because I've got the perfectionist thing in where I've just got to at some point go, you know what, it's good enough. Move on.
Well, like I'm very conscientious as well, and I find that sometimes I could get stuck in the weeds of like really shallow work, just organizing things, because it makes me, you know, like I can't start doing work if a room is, you know, just covered in mess. You know what I mean? I need to clean it first, make sure everything's in order. Then I can start thinking. It's the same thing if I'm looking at a work day and I've got 2 major tasks that I want to spend an hour and a half on each, but I've got like an hour of small things that the small things will just bug the absolute shit out of me.
Yes.
To the point that it's almost impossible to get the 2 major tasks actually done. So yeah, it's being overly conscientious sometimes can be really, really tough. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But it's I think this is an element of your personality which will be very useful as we get into talking about the book and the process you've gone through in creating that book as well. So I found that quite interesting. Now, let's get into the deep stuff about why we're here today, which is this IVF, donor conception, sperm donors, all that sort of stuff that fits under this umbrella that you're writing about. So I've got a pretty good idea of how this space is and what's involved. I know with yourself, you've got a pretty interesting story, and I think it would be best for you to sort of explain that. The only research I'd done before this was one, I think I had in my notes, The Kids Are All Right, was a movie I watched back in like 2010 or 11. It's about 2 lesbians and they get a donor and they find the donor again, and then it's, you know, it turns into a drama and the family and all that sort of stuff.
As they always do.
Yeah, as it always does. And then there was the Four Corners mini doco, which was about a year or so ago, and I found that interesting because I had a very close mate at work who went through the IVF process, and I was learning about how tough it can be. As we were going through and doing our research, I learned about a few different pioneers, like Professor Alan Trounson. His work is very, very interesting. I think he completed the first ever IVF, what would you call it? Procedure, I guess?
Yeah, it's treatment.
Procedure, yeah, in Australia. And then I was just learning about the size of the industry. I think I was surprised by how big it was, for $500 million in revenue. This financial year that we're currently in, that's the estimate. I guess, maybe start off with telling us how you fell into this and why you chose to do it.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd always wanted to have kids. I'd always thought I was going to have 5 kids, which I changed that fairly quickly as I got older. And just never seemed to happen with the skydiving. You know, skydiving and kids don't necessarily go that well together. So I just seemed to get distracted all the time. And then I started seeing a guy when I was about my late 30s. He had 2 kids of his own. It was very clear that he didn't want any more. I secretly thought that I could change his mind, which is pretty delusional.
Yeah.
And then it got to a point where I thought, you know what? I really want to have a kid. So we separated, and then I did lots of research and went down the donor. Not enough. Still did a lot of research and went down the donor conception using a sperm donor option.
Yeah. Now let's get into that, because this is something that is very interesting. Because when you were looking at it, you were obviously looking at donors, but didn't you also have friends or people that you knew that had offered to donate to you as well?
Yes.
Something like that?
Well, when I thought, from the get-go, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to be completely open about this. I'm going to tell everybody that I am considering, or I'm going to go ahead with using a donor once I'd made the decision. And so, surprisingly, I didn't actually ask anybody. 5 friends or acquaintances offered. And I was amazed, in some cases a bit shocked, at the ease with which they said, oh yeah, you can have some of my sperm. As though it was some... You know, it wasn't a big thing.
Decision, yeah.
One of the guys had just separated from his wife the week before, so I suspect he just wanted to have sex.
That's so funny.
One was in a relationship and already had 2 kids. One was a friend of mine, a gay guy who lived in Sydney, and he wanted to do a bit of parenting. But I sort of thought, while I was really grateful to all these people for offering, I just thought, you know, it sounds complicated.
What do you mean by that, though?
So particularly where somebody already has their own children, well, they're now going to have another half sibling if I have my own child, a donor conceived child. So we're going to be connected forever, and those children are going to be connected forever, and their children. And you know, and in one case, I was like, well, does his ex-wife know?
Yeah.
You know, so what's the level of trust here? And at that point, I'd not done any research around legislation, around using a known donor. There are risks there, depending on how you set it up, in terms of access.
Huh.
And people change their minds about these things as well. Known donors, which is somebody who you know, and it may be somebody you met on social media, or it may be someone you've known for 30 years, still qualifies as a known donor, i.e. you're not going through a fertility clinic. You might make an agreement at the beginning, and they can work very well, those agreements, for a lot of people. But when children come into the picture and a person has said, look, I don't want to do any parenting, I'm happy for you to be the sole parent, or if you've got a partner, to do the parenting, and I would like to see the child every 6 months or 12 months, or share photos and so forth. And then they see the child and go, you know what, I'd like to spend Christmas with my child, or two every second weekend, you know?
Yeah.
And that can be complicated.
Yeah, because that was an interesting point. You know, you said in another blog post that, to your disappointment, the donor that you ended up settling with decided to remain anonymous, which I think you might have mentioned that you wish that you could maybe meet who they are or something like that. Do you remember that at all?
Well, anonymity is actually banned in Australia.
Yeah.
So I chose a US donor.
Yeah.
But if you choose through an Australian fertility clinic an international donor, then you can only choose a donor that is what's called ID release or ID consenting. So when your child turns 18, the sperm bank has to release details of the donor. Right. So their name, contact details, and so forth.
Right. So I'm just trying to think back to what that post was saying. Like, maybe you were saying you wish that you could meet them before your child turns 18 or something like that. Possibly.
Well, now in hindsight, I think it would be lovely for her, because she says to me, I'm starting to, a lot of donor conceived people don't have any issue. A lot of them are not interested in meeting their donor or their half siblings. Some of them just want to meet their half siblings and not the donor. Some of them don't want to meet either, and that's absolutely fine. But there are a lot of donor-conceived people with a lot of trauma and grief. And my daughter has started saying, the last couple of years, I wish I had a daddy.
Mm.
I wish I could meet
Them.
she knows his name, I won't say it, but him. And so I'm, through all my research, and I'm on a lot of groups where there's a lot of donor-conceived adults, I probably before had a very one-dimensional view of the whole thing, and that was as a donor recipient. But now my eyes have been well and truly open to the potential issues and things that can come up for donor-conceived kids and adults. And one of them is that they don't have access to their biological parent, who's 50% of their makeup.
Yeah, exactly. How old is your daughter now?
7.
She's 7. Wow. Because the articles I was looking at, she looks like she was young, like 1 or 2 years old. So that those articles might be a few years old. That's super interesting. Yeah, because that's one of the key topics that I was chatting to Eileen about, is these moral questions.
Yeah.
I want to get into that really deeply but I think it's better that people understand this whole process. So
sure.
Maybe if you could start by, you've decided that you want to go through the donor system and do IVF and have a child. Maybe let's start with sitting down with Eileen on Fitzroy Street, choosing your donor, and go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, because I was 40, I think, at the time when I started, I had this really strong sense of urgency. I need to make this happen, because I'm actually the chances of me becoming pregnant are pretty slim. And I think that's part of the problem in the industry, is a lot of people rush through it, especially solo women, single women, not necessarily so much in the LGBTI community, where people might be younger. So we sat down, the fertility clinic said, all right, here's the website for the sperm bank. I'd made a decision to use an international donor because there are not that many local donors available. That's
right. And also Victoria at the time didn't allow single mothers, right?
Single women and lesbians could not access IVF in Victoria.
Because there was such a, that was the rule that they come up with or something, because there was such a lack of sperm or whatever. Seems
just
pretty
some
rough.
Archaic, law that has fortunately changed since then. So I went to Sydney, chose a donor, a US donor.
Okay.
And went through one round of IVF. Nothing happened. And then at the time, the laws were changing in New South Wales as well, around the number of people or families that a donor could, they call them family limits. So it was 10 families that a donor could contribute to.
Yeah.
And they were talking about reducing it to 5. So they sent us across to Canberra and I had to choose another donor, go through the whole process again, which involved... I don't really like saying this now, because now that my understanding of donor-conceived adults and the grief and the angst and anger that they can go through, not all, but a lot, is that it's commodification of children, and you have to pay for sperm, and it's like they set it up so it's like a dating website.
Yeah.
And you've got a list of blokes, or if you're an egg donor or embryo, it'll be different, but in the case of a sperm donor, and there'll be a profile. So if it's a US donor, many of them will have an adult photo, not all, but many. They'll have a childhood photo, they'll have a lot of information, height, weight, eye colour, ancestry, medical history, which I now understand is all self-reported, so they don't check on.
No, there's no audit of it at all.
It's like, so it's up to the donor, to be honest, in a lot of the information that they provide. And in this instance, he had written a little essay, and he'd written it to any potential children. So it was really lovely. And he'd also said that his sister used a donor, and that was why he was donating. So I liked that there was this altruistic, well, even though he's paid. So I can't really say it was altruistic, but there was a nice feel, to him. And there was an audio file as well.
Oh, wow. So has your daughter read any of this? Or have you read this to her, or has she listened to the audio as well?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's so... I feel like this field or this area is still in the very, very early days. I feel like a lot of these questions and these issues are being worked out? Like the fact that you said before about how in America they still get paid. You know, I know here you don't get paid for donation. It's like a very altruistic decision. But also like the setup of the websites, you know, the fact that things aren't like the health elements aren't really audited, although they do health checks though, don't they?
The sperm bank. Oh, you're talking about fertility clinics here, or
both?
Or both. Well, yeah, they do health checks. There's quite a process that a donor has to go through, and some of it again is self-reported here, and they'll do checks. If it's a sperm bank, they'll list on their website the checks they go through, but mistakes are made, as per my last blog, where you know women have experienced some terrible things.
Yeah, some of the stories on that are unbelievable. Which we'll get into a bit later. But so you selected your donor, and then you did the first procedure. You went to Canberra, did the second. Fell pregnant, had a miscarriage. Yeah, about 7 weeks. Okay, with the second donor, and then fortunately I'd purchased another vial because I think he'd actually run out of sperm. He was very popular, and fell pregnant the third time as well, and then maintained the pregnancy. Wow. Conceived rather than fell pregnant. That's a term. I conceived. And so the IVF process, because that was one of the most interesting things. Like how do they do that? Is it like a procedure where they implant the egg, right?
Well, just because you use a donor, you don't necessarily have to do IVF. You can do intrauterine insemination.
Really?
Yeah. It depends. Usually, some people do at-home insemination. There's usually an age where fertility clinics will say we're not doing that because the chances of you becoming pregnant are too low.
Right.
And they'll push you to IVF straight away. And so you can do that. A clinic can also assist you with insemination. Okay. If you use a known donor, like I said, you can do that at home. If you can go online and buy a insemination kit.
Really?
DIY.
Wow. So I wouldn't have thought that they'd let you do that. That's super fascinating.
Yeah, it was very expensive to do IVF. I was going to say drugs, and a lot of people don't want to do that.
But even then, if you're buying the donor sperm, then like at least that would be pretty expensive. Like it would raise the risk. I don't know. Like I'm just thinking about that cost benefit analysis. You know, like if you're going to do that, it depends on your situation, of course.
And it does, because in a lot of cases, there's what's called medical infertility. Mm-hmm. So and there's a definition, and if you don't meet the definition of medical infertility, you don't get the Medicare rebate, which means one IVF cycle is about $12,000.
Really?
And so if you are a lesbian, for example, or a single woman, you're technically, they have get dished a fairly base sort of term, which is social infertility, which has no legal meaning or anything, but it's because you're not having sex with a man, you are socially infertile because you can't get pregnant. So it's really challenging for people in that situation.
Right. So maybe just explain. So let's say someone, the end of the road is IVF. What are the steps before that? Like when you go to these reproductive services clinics, what are they talking to you about? Like let's say if you're 33 and you're just struggling to get pregnant, like what are the first things they go through with you before they say do IVF?
First of all, they would look at your age. They would look at your relationship. Mm-hmm. If you are in a same-sex relationship, then obviously things are going to fall differently. If you're in a solo relationship, you're just coming as a single person. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's age, I think, and history. So they might look at your fertility history. Do you have a history of becoming pregnant, miscarriage, or something like endometriosis, where it's very difficult to conceive? Mm-hmm. So they look at those things initially. And again, depending on the fertility clinic and their processes, some are better than others at just throwing you into the process and, all right, let's do IVF, and then realising later on, actually, we should have checked a few things first after you've dished out a whole lot of money, whereas some are better at saying, let's do some assessment first on you. So that's one of the things I've written about in the book, is that you need to ask a whole lot of questions.
100%. And that was sort of covered in that doco, mini doco on Four Corners, about sort of the failure rate for women over 40, or maybe it was 45, or some number like that, and how I guess clinics aren't really, not that they're not permitting of the knowledge, but they're not very forthright in telling you, if that makes sense. So they're not very honest about your chances. And so when I was looking at that, I just thought, you know, what's your opinion on that? Like, do you think the clinics should state these facts to the person, or do you think it doesn't matter because a person will just continue to do it within their means?
They actually have to. They have to provide the success rate.
Okay.
The problem has been, and the ACCC have sort of been involved in this, is that they can use lots of language and definition that vary between clinics. And, for example, they might just talk about success rate in terms of a pregnancy, but a pregnancy doesn't mean you're going to have a live birth, which is an industry term. In other words, you're going to have a child at the end of it. So people can be a little bit
they're misguided. In what the outcome's going to be. Yeah, because they see pregnancy, they're like, oh, that's quite a lot.
Yes. So,
and I think that's what that doco was covering, is like the terms of live birth versus pregnancy and so forth.
Yes. It's big business.
It is.
And it's even bigger in the US.
I can imagine, because a lot of this stuff isn't as regulated as it is here.
There's very limited regulation there.
Yeah. Well, so you had your daughter, Lara. What did you learn from, I guess, that pregnancy? You were basically doing it on your own, weren't you?
Yeah.
What did that teach you?
Well, it's been an interesting process. I absolutely loved being pregnant.
Yeah.
Despite...
Why is that?
Well, I was reflecting on that recently with somebody, and I think it was because I was 41. Or when I gave birth, I was 41. And I think I knew this was it. I wasn't going to have another child after that. So I think I just really... And I was in a really good space. I think if I'd had a child in my 20s, I would have been a terrible mother. Not suggesting I'm Mother of the Year now or anything either, but I'm a much better mother now than I would have been in my 20s when I was still, going through all my own shit. But who I was, my identity, and all those things that you go through. And so I really enjoyed it very much. And even when, a lot of people say, oh my God, I can't wait for this thing to come out, this child to come out, I'm over it. I was like, oh, no, I'm really happy. She's going to come out when she's ready.
Yeah. It must be such a unique experience. I can imagine it would be weird because you don't really have much control over it. It's just your body doing its thing.
Yes.
I remember I've had this conversation with my partner a few times about the fact that, like what do you do when like you're actually having to give birth to a child? It's like, well, your body will just do it. You're not really, you thinking about it is irrelevant because it's just going to happen.
Yeah, the body knows what to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Now, the other thing that I was fascinated by in this sort of discussion of IVF and sort of the risk factors and all that, and I think I had here in my notes, I got completely distracted watching a 1 hour doco of the Obamas. But she actually, I had no idea, like Michelle Obama had to go through IVF because she had multiple miscarriages, which would have been awful.
Yeah.
I think something like 4.
Right.
It's quite a lot.
I think miscarriage is something that's not spoken about a lot.
It's not.
A lot of women have had miscarriages, and it's just sort of one of those things you just...
Yeah, well, I know that my grandmother did, and, luckily for me, if she had not had that miscarriage, then my father would probably never have been born.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's sort of one of those things that she always spoke about, and was sort of present in our family's mind because of it. Now, part of that doco was talking about these sort of risk factors, and I think a lot of our audience would probably be around the age of, say, 25 to 35, and there'd be some people who would be thinking about, well, I don't want to have to go through this sort of stuff, like I don't want to have to do IVF. And I'm just intrigued from your perspective. It seemed, at least from watching these docos, that the greatest sort of factor was age. Do you think there are other things as well that people often miss, like lifestyle and diet? What is sort of the key factor that someone needs or requires to use IVF?
Yeah, definitely diet and lifestyle. I've got a chapter in my book on, I call it conscious conception, and that's a bit of a theme throughout the whole book.
Okay.
Is that don't just rush into this thing like a bull at a gate, which I probably did to an extent myself because I was older. The fertility window was closing, as they say.
Yeah.
Is that there are a number of, particularly if you're using a donor, you need to consider your own health. You need to know, I'm not just specifically talking about IVF here, I'm talking about donor conception, but you need to know your own history of medical stuff. And I know a lot of people who are in a relationship or a marriage and are going to have children don't. They just go, all right, let's have kids, and they go and do it. So I know it doesn't necessarily happen that way anyway, but if you're considering donor conception, then I think it's a really good idea to know any themes, for example, breast cancer themes, cardiac type themes,
yeah.
Inherited disease, all that stuff. I think it's really important for a person to know that. And if you're going through a fertility clinic, they will test for a lot of that stuff anyway.
Really?
Yeah.
Like for you personally, not for just the donor?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. But I think it's important to do your own homework as well. Ask your family, because a lot of those things are not talked about. And a lot of people in the past, I wrote about in one of my blogs, died of old age. And that was what was on their death certificate. So nobody really knew what they died of. So some of the stuff is difficult or impossible to uncover anyway. But to do as much research as you can about that, because if you can avoid passing on something to your child, then I think that's, of course, good.
Handy.
A good thing to do.
Yeah.
The person who doesn't get any say in any of these decisions.
So do they do gene tests then for you as well?
I can't even remember. I don't think so.
Okay.
No, it was more to do with STIs, HIV, AIDS.
Yeah, it'd be more to do with that stuff that they can actively test at an affordable rate. Because some of those gene tests are very expensive.
They do it on donors.
Yeah, of course. That must be interesting, mustn't it? Like looking at their profile and like, oh yeah, he's got this, but he doesn't have that. That's so, that is strange. Like as if you're looking at sort of a software product, do you know what I mean? With features.
Yeah. That's why I was saying earlier that I'm a bit hesitant to talk about it like in that sense, because a lot of the donor conceived adults and some of the forums I'm on, so that's where they talk about, they feel like a product, that they were selected off a website. Their 50% of their genetic makeup was selected off a website, paid for. It's really offensive to them.
I can understand, but it's also a very cynical way of looking at their life. Like I know I would do that. I would sort of look at it like that, but the reality is you're alive. Like life is good. It's not even that. Like the probability of you being alive is like, some ungodly amount. Like something like 1 in a trillion or something like that.
Oh, really?
Maybe it's 3 trillion. Like the fact that the specific sperm in that group paired with that specific egg made you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the possibilities of conceiving a lot of things have to happen.
But for you to be you, do you know what I mean? Like it could have been a totally different person, like with a totally different genetic makeup that isn't you, and you wouldn't be alive. Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
true.
I've always found that fascinating. There's this guy, he's sort of like a self-improvement marketing type, but he's actually a very successful businessman. He always sort of, people get to ask him a question about, what do you do when you don't have much motivation? He's like, you're alive. Like, and he goes through that probability and talks about that. And it's just,
the optimist.
Yeah, be the eternal optimist, I guess. One of the things I was obviously identifying was that it seems like there's a shortage of donors. So, there may be some people listening and thinking, maybe I will do it. Like I'm reasonable in terms of fitness, height, all the stuff that they sort of, categorize you by at these clinics. What would you say to someone who's considering becoming a sperm donor?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a number of different ways of doing it. You can go through a fertility clinic where you will be tested and go through all the screen testing and things. And there's also, you can become a known donor, and there are sites, there are matching sites, there are Facebook groups where you can get with people. So, but in all situations, I think a sperm donor or an egg donor or an embryo donor need to consider, and this is what I've understood from all the donor conceived people or adults that I've spoken with, heard from, is that you need to understand what's going to happen at the end of the process. A kid.
Yeah.
There's going to be a little human being, potentially, or multiple human beings that are born who don't get a say in any of this process, and that person may want to connect with you. So don't think that you can remain anonymous if you become a known donor. It is impossible. So there's DNA testing every week on this particular group that I'm on. There's a new person going, I just got a DNA kit for Christmas, and guess what? I just found out I'm donor conceived. And, there's, in a lot of cases, there's trauma. They've been lied to for years, and they're trying to find out what's their next step. So as a donor, I'd say make sure you understand your family history. Even if you become a known donor and you don't go through a fertility clinic, go and get yourself screen tested. Do all those things. If you become a known donor, discuss in depth with the recipient, what your thoughts and feelings are. Check in again later on when the child's born. Keep checking in. Identify what it is that you both want out of the relationship. If anything, make sure that you're comfortable with being connected later on, because that's where the most trauma and grief is, from donor conceived people who make contact with their donor and the donor doesn't want to know them.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting in that regard. That sort of raises a lot of those moral questions, which I want to get into now. But just with the groups, are there particular Facebook groups that you'd recommend that people start having a look at in particular?
If you're a potential recipient?
Either recipient or donor.
Yeah, definitely. There's just look for donor conceived on Facebook. Yeah, they're private groups, but you can just pop in, what it is, whether you're a recipient donor or a donor conceived person.
Yeah.
There's private donor conceived adult groups as well, just for people who are donor conceived.
Okay.
There's ones for DNA testing.
Wow.
If you're donor conceived and you want to go and find out who your donor is, or you cannot hide.
We might get a few links from you when we do our show notes about particular groups that you're connected with that are more public, I guess, and not as private.
Yeah, sure.
Which would be very interesting. But yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things for me when I was looking at this stuff for donors is a lot of the messaging is about being selfless, and I often wonder, like, if they pivoted that to being selfish and focusing on the sort of the DNA element, if the biological imperative is to spread your DNA, then that is a way of doing it. I wonder how much that would help in a way for the amount, for the lack, because just looking at a lot of the stuff, it still says there's a lack of sperm donors that are around.
Yeah. Well, I think fertility clinics could do better than that. I think they could get a bit of their hard-earned cash and use a bit of that for recruitment.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that you mentioned as well, is like some fertility clinics, when you go to them, they have really specific type of criteria, don't they? Like, they don't accept people who are short, or they don't accept people who have red hair. What else? There were some other things.
This is in the US mainly.
Is it in the US? Okay.
Well, in Australia, there's still criteria. However, in the US, because they're paid and they recruit a lot of college students with catchy slogans, come and get paid for what you're already doing, all this kind of stuff. And they don't, if you are going to donate to an Australian person, they have to go through counselling to Australian standards.
That's right.
But if they're going to donate just to anybody else in the US, for example, there's no counselling, potentially. Not all sperm banks are like this, but a lot of them. No counselling. So it's kind of presented as a job. Rock up twice a week for a year. Make sure you don't drink alcohol, take drugs, have sex a couple of days beforehand so that your sperm passes muster, because you only get paid when your sperm passes muster, and then your job's done. Thanks, see you later. And then, they go and get a partner, they have their own kids, haven't told their partner or their kids,
Jeez.
that they donated, and then 20, 30 years later, they've got 100 kids knocking on the door wanting to connect with them, and now their own kids have 100 donor-conceived siblings.
Wow.
It's complex.
Yeah.
So it needs to be out there, and, we're playing catch-up.
I think so. I think that's sort of the model that comes with having data widely available is going to be the best approach, as opposed to, wrapped under lock and key is going to save a lot of heartache. I know that with, there's a lot of moral questions here. Look, I think in all of these problems, if you look at the pros and the cons, the pro far outweighs the con. Like, the reality is a life's created, someone exists. So I think that outweighs a lot of the issues that come with it. But, some of the specific issues you've talked about is sperm donors who donate on the proviso of remaining anonymous. I know in Australia you can't do that now. I think that right was changed recently. Here in Victoria, at least.
In Australia.
In Australia,
yeah. Australia-wide. Yeah.
You've spoken about women choosing similar racial or profile characteristics. Number of children, as you said, one donor is allowed to have. And there's actually, I think there's a bit of research saying to be done. I think Eileen noted here, Terry Callagher of the Australian Family Association talks about how often donor-conceived children are often in a similar geographic location, and the potential for them to form a relationship exponentially goes up as that donor has more and more children. Hence, they've started to cap the amount of couples or people that you can donate to.
Except there's a big complexity there, because in Australia, while the recommended amount is either 5 or 10 families, depending on the state, if you choose an international donor, particularly in the US, they have a worldwide limit. So, and they don't have to police it. So, for example, my donor has been used by over 80 families, and they're only the ones that report the birth, which is another interesting thing, in that most of the sperm banks in the US leave 100% onus on the recipients to report a live birth, and the sperm banks don't follow up with anybody. So the numbers sort of come trickling in, and only about 40 or 50% of people report a live birth in the US.
Really?
A lot of the others either forget, or they don't bother, or because of cultural reasons, or a number of other reasons, they don't report the birth, nor in many instances do they tell their children that they're donor conceived. So you've got all these people out there who are related and don't know it, and it's the Wild West.
Yeah, the other thing with the sperm banks, you said, is that they can sometimes lie depending on the bank.
Donors?
Donors, like to potential, couples or people looking to conceive a child through a donor. Like, I think you spoke about one where they said the donor had an IQ of 160, was at Harvard and all that, and then they turned out to be a convicted felon. And
he had paranoid schizophrenia. Had been diagnosed. Yeah, so that happens because there's this element of self-reporting. I mean, there are many amazing donors out there.
Of course,
there's lots of wonderful people who are literally, generous and honest and doing it. But there is that element of risk, and I think that's one of the things that people need to understand going into it. And of course, you can't really interview your donor if you're getting them from a fertility clinic or a sperm bank. And there is a big element of trust that they've done their job in the screening.
So if you had to sit down with the Australian government or even international governments and come up with a better system, how would you do it? Like, would you look at some sort of peak body that, I don't know, that people sign an agreement to, sort of how they sign in with the World Trade Organization? All signatory nations of the UN generally sign up to WTO trade requirements, and if they don't follow by them, corporations can take companies to court at The Hague or whatever their system is. I'm sure I think it's the World Health Org. There'd be something that governs a lot of these practices medically across the world. Have you ever thought about some sort of peak body that acted around this space at all?
Yeah, well, originally when I started writing the book, I thought I could write this as a universal book. But when I started doing my research into the countries and the various ways in which things occurred, legislation, lack thereof, anonymity, no anonymity, it was just too hard. So I've restricted the book to Australia, which doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not Australian, you shouldn't read it, because a lot of the themes are still universal. But there needs to be big change in the industry. It's creating a lot of angst, and many things are problematic. There's Victoria is probably leading the world in terms of change.
Really?
Yeah, VARTA, which is Victorian Assisted Reproductive Technology Authority. They are suggested are leading the world in terms of counselling, connecting people from families, introducing new legislation. There's current talk about doing a national donor bank. So in Australia, so that they can have a pool of donors nationally.
Yeah.
You can then control whether a donor is going to donate at a clinic in Queensland and then hopping across to WA and donating over there on the sly. This sort of thing.
Wow. And so you'd like to see a national registry like that be... What sort of practices would you like to see it do in terms of the moral issues? Like knowing... Do you think it has to be a requirement that when someone is donating, they realise that they're going to have to be contacted at some point? They can't just remain anonymous?
Well, in Australia, that's already the case.
Yeah.
And if you choose an international donor at an Australian fertility clinic, again, it's the same. But the donor doesn't have to comply with that. So yes, you can get their name and their contact details, but they may not wish to have any contact with you, and they don't have to meet up or whatever it is that donor conceived adult now at 18 or may wish to do. So there's still an element of risk and rejection around that. But I think there's a number of things that could change. Some Commonwealth legislation. There's only legislation in a handful of states, no legislation in others. So currently there's some ethical guidelines which fertility clinics have to abide by, and they get audited, and at worst they can be closed down if they don't. But, it's a slow sort of probably a catch-up process. VARTA and the Victorian government currently have a thing where if you use fertility treatment in Victoria, if you undergo treatment in Victoria, then your birth certificate, your initial birth certificate that gets handed out at birth, it just has your legal parents on it, which may be a single person or a married couple or a same-sex couple, whoever that is. The intended parent is the legal parents. But if that person becomes 18 and then seeks their birth certificate out later on to get a passport, for instance, then there'll be a second page that says, we have further information for you. And they can contact them and they say you're donor conceived. So they may or may already know that, but if they don't know it, then they'll know. But that's only Victoria.
Really?
Wow. So that kind of thing.
That's super fascinating. Yeah, that opens a whole can of worms, doesn't it? Whether the person should know, like who should be the person to, there must be a whole, imagine the process, like coming up with the process of who gets to be the person to tell people that.
Yeah, that would not be. Well, they'd have counselling. VARTA offer counselling. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
now, on the book, because that was one of the things you just said before about making it universal for everyone, which had me chuckle quite a bit.
Yeah, a bit of a dream.
Yeah.
Delusional.
Well, have you thought about? So you're looking at this. You've done your research. When will the book be done? I think I noticed on your website it said 2019. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd like it to be out this year.
Okay, late this year or
probably late this year.
Okay. Now, the general structure, it seems to be a how-to book on how to, particularly for donor-conceived people, how to approach this space, essentially.
Or more donor recipients.
Donor
people
recipients.
Who are entering the process.
Yeah. How do you go about it? So, I guess I'm curious as to what are the key factors that people need to look for when they're attempting to consider a donor or or become, to create a donor-conceived person in a way.
Yeah, when I started writing the book, I noticed that there was a lot of memoirs out there, which are great and really interesting and helpful to an extent. But I wanted to write something that I wish that I'd had before I jumped into the process. So it starts off with a little bit about my story, and then it goes into the types of donors. So fertility clinic recruited, international donor, known donors, and so on, and how they all work, pros and cons, and then a bit about egg donors, so sperm donors, and then chapter on egg donors, embryo donors, because they all work quite differently. And then how to choose a donor. So what are the things that you need to consider when you're choosing a donor or donors, because some people need to use an egg and a sperm donor. What are the things you need to consider? What are the questions that you need to ask of your fertility clinic or of your known donor or of your international sperm or egg bank or egg agency? And how do you choose a fertility clinic? Because there are a number of factors there which may influence. Then also a chapter on donors. So what's it like to be a donor? What's the process that you go through? Sperm, egg and embryo. And why do people donate? Chapter on laws. So what is the current legislation, both state or, if any, Commonwealth legislation? It's only a little bit. And what does it mean for you? It's sort of a Q&A one, that one. So who owns your embryo, that kind of thing.
And have you covered the sort of these moral questions that we've spoken about, like how to discuss it with the child and all that sort of stuff? Yeah, so then there's another chapter on how to contact each other. So do you want to contact siblings or a donor, how to connect? So there's registries around, certain states have central registers and voluntary registers, which function slightly differently. But that's about connecting families. And in the absence of a central or voluntary register, the fertility clinics act as that role, and they all have slightly different processes and different standards. So it's very hodgepodge about what they'll tell you. And so that's where a national database and egg and sperm bank would be fantastic, and legislation. And then there's a chapter on what to tell your child, when to tell your child, what's age appropriate, when to connect with other siblings, half siblings, when to connect with donor, if and when, if those sort of things strike. And the whole book is full of what's called boxed stories. So stories from individuals, donors, donor recipients, donor conceived people. So that question you answer, yes, it kind of is a theme throughout the book. It's sort of throughout it, yeah. How have you approached it with your daughter so far? Like, at what age did you tell her? I told her before she even understood. Okay. And it started when I was in the supermarket, and she was running behind me. She was only about 2, I think. Okay. And she was, as kids do, pulling everything off the shelves, and I was pretending to ignore. And she yelled out, "Mummy!" And then she said, "Daddy!" And I went, "Oh, okay, I think I better start addressing this now." So I started talking to her about her conception, and I bought a little book. There's quite a lot of children's resources for how to tell, whether you're a solo mother, whether you're a lesbian couple, whether you're a trans couple, or you're just an egg donor. There's, everything is there for you, and you can write bits in the book yourself as well to make it a bit more personal. Okay. And so I said, we talked about that. She's read the book, not to overdo it, not to shove it in her face, just normalise it. Yeah. And then it's evolved, the conversation, especially with my doing the research and talking to donor-conceived adults. I used to say, and this is what fertility clinics and sperm banks say, is that, you don't have a dad, you have a donor. And as one donor-conceived person said, well, it's not my donor. He didn't donate anything to me. He's your donor. Yeah. He's my biological father or my biological mother. Yeah. So I've now said to her, and she's kind of taken over the conversation. I used to tell people. Really? She's donor conceived, and because I wanted to normalise it for her and not, there's no shame around it. It just is who you are. It's part of your identity. You can shape it yourself with all the information that I'm making available to you. And we were at a party. Arlie was there. It was a fairy unicorn party. And one of these little girls came over to Lara and said, "Do you have any siblings?" Which is very unusual. They normally ask if you have brothers and sisters.
And she used to say, oh yeah, I've got 100 brothers and 100 sisters. And people would go, liar, and she'd come running to me and go, Mummy, And now she just kind of looked at me and she said, oh, look, it's a bit complicated. If you want to know, just go and ask my mum. I thought, oh, right. And there's a transition now.
She's over it.
She's owning it.
Yeah.
So it's in her space. And I've said to her as well, in my learning through these adults, that she needs to be able to say whatever she wants to say, and not to shut down the conversation and say you don't have a daddy. She actually does have a biological father. So we've had conversations around that now, and I say, you know what? If people ask, and I've given her a few options, I said, you can say, yes, I have a father, but he lives in America and he's not part of my daily experience, or something like that, or yeah, I have a dad, but I don't see him, or we've talked about options, which is more difficult, of course, if you are a hetero couple and you've used a donor because there's male infertility. It would be a different conversation.
But if it's one adult or one parent, then people would sort of understand and just go a bit quiet.
Yeah.
Do you think that she wants to meet? Has she said that she wants to meet her dad?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How have you broached that?
Well, I've said that would be fantastic, but I can't promise you that.
Yeah.
I hope he does. I hope he, when you're allowed to contact him, when you want to contact him, that he's open to that.
Yeah.
But,
how old is it again that they can? It's 18, right?
Well, if you are in Victoria and you use an Australian donor in Victoria, you can actually go through a voluntary register, and it's a bit like a matching site, the voluntary register. If you say, I'm Gail and my daughter, if you get a match, so if the donor also wants to connect, you can connect as soon as the child's born.
Right.
Otherwise, it's either 16 or 18, depending on the state.
Okay.
So there needs to be more of that introduced as well, because a lot of donors, there's a bit of a cultural shift in Australia as well, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact they're not being paid, and it's altruistic, and we have to be ID release. That a lot of donors are now saying, I want to meet my kids, my donor conceived children, and so they're telling, they're trying to connect early on, which is fantastic for the kids. I think.
With the clinic you went to was in Canberra, so is that the 16, 18?
This is a bit of an area of controversy, because the sperm bank says I'm not allowed to make contact with him before my daughter. I'm not allowed to make contact. My daughter can make contact with him when she turns 18, or attempt. Sorry, she can get his identifying details when she turns 18, and then if she wants to, she can make contact with him. Whether or not he wants to reciprocate is up to him. But what a lot of people are doing is they're finding their donor on Facebook,
well, that's what
LinkedIn.
I was just thinking. Like, in this day, you speaking about these Facebook groups, like, surely now we're in this era where people just would be like, well, I can just find him on Facebook.
Before they even choose him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people are saying, don't do that because it's not okay, because, he might head for the hills and never make contact with the kids. Like, you know what? The lid's off. We're in a world where it's pretty easy to find people, and they're providing information to sperm banks, for example, in the US. I keep going back to that because that's sort of, a crazy place. And sperm banks are selling these ideals to sperm donors that, we can pay you $1,500 a month to come and be a sperm donor, do your job, and see you later. Whereas, and they're going to give them lots of information, adult photos, Google photo, Google image, find you. So they need to shift
the perspective
and stop convincing these men, in particular, that they won't be found.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. Honestly, could you think going into this that you wouldn't? Like, I just don't know that I could rationally think, well, because their first name, right?
No.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Oh, that's even anonymous.
Well, our donor in his audio file said what his name was.
Did he? Okay.
Yeah.
Full name?
No.
Okay. I was going to say.
But he may be, we may have found him.
Okay.
Shh,
yeah, because that's all I would think about. I just want to find out who they are.
Yeah, and that's what, as a donor-conceived person, so you're 50%, or in the case of where your parents use an egg and sperm donor, you've both your biological parents. That's not to take away from the parents that have raised you, and all donor-conceived people say that. So it does not change how much I love my parents. It's not a scary thing. I just want to complete this circle.
Yeah.
This genetic thing. A lot of people say it's just genes, and they say, well, it's not just genes, it's who I am, and I want to know this person. I want to meet them. Or at least at a bare minimum, I want medical information from this person.
Well, there's stories in our history, which I love, obviously documenting through what we do. And I mean, just to know who they are, who their parents are, their background, all that sort of stuff is, it's your identity, isn't it?
And this is one of the things I've learned, because I had a fairly, like I said, a narrow perspective coming into it. But there are grandparents, there are aunties and uncles. So in other words, the donor's parents, the donor's siblings, they want to know, in some cases, I want to meet these donor-conceived children of yours because I'm related to them. I want to welcome them into my family. So, and there's potential grief there as well. Imagine, I was just thinking about my donor who knows how many kids there are? I don't know. Let's
just say 100.
Last count was 104, but that was only the people that had reported a birth, and the sperm bank won't tell me anymore. They just shut me down. Sorry, we're not telling you. So
really?
Yeah.
Why? Because you asked too many questions.
Well, it kind of begs the question, doesn't it, really?
That's really bad.
Yeah. So I think about his parents. Do they want to know the kids? Maybe they do.
All I know is now is I want to know. Like it's just of course, like it's I don't know, there's something really unnatural about that, like a corporation thinking that you're just gonna not divulge that sort of information. And this whole that's the real sticky thing about this process, because going through this, I even said to my partner the other night, like, eventually once we have our own kids, like why not become a donor? Like it's, again, going back to the selfishness element, plus you can help people who want to have kids, but I was just thinking about that, like, I don't know, I would want to know, obviously, and, you'd expect in the circumstances that you would abide by the rules that the parents set within reason, right?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't, it just feels weird being completely anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not really possible.
Yeah, exactly
in
right.
today's day and age. The other thing about that is the siblings. So a lot of people don't tell their donor-conceived child that they have siblings, or if they don't tell them till later. And a lot of adults say, why? You told us about our cousins, our aunties and uncles, our grandparents. Why would you not tell us about them? And now I'm 25, and now I've got to connect with them as a 25-year-old. I've missed 25 years of my life connecting with them. And so we have relationships with some of our siblings. We've got a Facebook group with our international, a lot of international people from US and Canada who share the same donor. And we have people down the road who we catch up with regularly. We've got a daughter and a son from the same donor. And it's really beautiful. It's not scary. I think a lot of people fear that something's going to shift. I don't know, that their child may not love them in the same way. I'm not, there's a lot of fear around that, but I just need to say it's not scary. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's really allows your child, certainly in my instance, she's shaping her identity around all of this. I'm giving her all the information I can, and she's shaping it for herself. And she can choose not to. She might one day go, you know what, I don't want to know any of them. Yeah. And that's fine too.
Yeah.
But at least she can make that decision herself.
Yeah. Do you think your daughter looks more like you or the father, or do you see a bit of both in her?
Yeah, people tell me she's a mini me. Yeah.
That's so funny. I couldn't help but thinking, while you're writing this book, you must have come across some crazy stories in this whole process. What's the most, I guess, bizarre or interesting thing that you've found thus far?
I think I would have to say it's when people come into these groups and they're telling us what, and I can't obviously name names or anything like that because they're private, but things like, I just found out I'm donor conceived and my parents just separated and my mum said, "Don't worry, darling, that dickhead's not your father anyway."
Wow.
So really horrendous things, yeah. Or don't you dare contact that donor, I'll never speak to you again. Or if you contact that donor, I'm going to sue you for breach of privacy. This is to their children. Yeah, so really horrific and wacky stuff that these people, the shame that they've passed, the shame of infertility or whatever the shame is that they're carrying, has now been passed down to their children for existing.
It goes to show, like, even people who in, these circumstances who are trying their best to conceive a child can still be pretty awful people. Like you see some pretty awful parents out there on playgrounds and whatnot. So,
well, that raises a really good point actually, because a lot of people say don't describe your donor unless you know him or her as a really lovely, generous, beautiful person who gave me this sperm or this egg, because you don't know. Because certainly if you're choosing a US donor, they got paid. So, and they may have just used it as beer money. They may not. They may be a beautiful, generous person. Just say the facts. He's 6 foot. He's got green eyes. Keep it at that. Because if your daughter or son gets to meet that person, or they say, F off, I don't want to know you, and they've grown up their whole lives thinking they're a beautiful, generous, lovely person, and now they're faced with this intense rejection, then, you've built it up to...
Yeah, you've built up their expectations to a point which are unrealistic, I think.
Yeah, so just keep to the facts.
Yeah. Before we jump into the short, fast questions, I've got to ask, in your own research in this space, who were sort of the leaders that you've looked to? Where are the resources that you've looked to? I'm just thinking about the person who's listening and is interested by this space, interested by donor conception. Where would you recommend that they start looking and reading, apart from, of course, your book when it comes to...
of course.
The blog.
A book that's in process. Well, definitely Varta. And Varta, even though it's only... it's Victorian, on their website they have national information. So related to other states, they've got all the legislation that applies to each state. Not that each state has legislation, all the Commonwealth legislation. They are the most up to date. And the people at Varta are amazing. Kate Bourne is fantastic.
Yeah, they had an amazing they've got this story bank or something like that where I saw you share it a while ago, or maybe you posted about it. These donors creating sort of recorded, things for if the donor has died and the donor conceived child can go back and look at them.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the, well, they won't be kids by that stage.
Yeah.
Because a lot of, I don't know how much happens in Australia, but a lot of sperm sits in the freezer. Or embryos sit in the freezer for a long time. And so you might have siblings with 20 years difference and the donor might be old or has died. So
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So Varta are a fantastic resource.
Yeah.
One donor conceived person that I've had a lot of contact with is Chloe Allworthy, and she has lots of YouTube videos on what not to say to a donor conceived person, what they hate hearing. And of course, she's not speaking for everybody because some don't care, but a lot of them, the people that do care, I think, are the ones that we can really learn a lot from to avoid in the future.
So there's Chloe Allworthy.
Chloe Allworthy, yeah.
Okay, we'll make sure we link her
channel. Yeah, she's got some fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
Who else? There's some fantastic books out there. Like I said, a lot of memoir. One book that I read early on was called Sex Cells, as in CELLS, by Renee Armling, I think her name is. And that was really interesting about the industry and how sperm donors versus egg donors and how it's, in inverted commas, sold to them. And sperm donors, it's sold as a job, and at the end of it, thanks very much, see you later. Whereas egg donors, it's this beautiful thing that you can do, and it's a gift that you've given, and it's a culture that they create at that level, which impacts the whole process.
The whole system. Do the women in the US, they get paid?
They do get paid, yeah.
Is there a paid difference at all there? Like, because, obviously it's a lot easier to extract sperm than it is an egg. I'm guessing the women might get paid a little bit more.
They do get paid considerably more, and there's a limit to how many, egg cycles they can go through.
Really?
It's because you have to take drugs, and you can do damage. And
interesting.
Person, yeah.
Wow. The whole paid element is really fascinating to me.
There's a lot of talk. There's ongoing talk in Australia about paying donors, and some people think we should pay donors because there's not enough donors and people heading overseas as a result, where there's more risk and things. But in my opinion, for what it's worth, I just think it's dangerous territory. We know there's all sorts of shonky things that happen, and even blood banks where people are paid, people lie.
Yeah. Well, the things become distorted for money, I think.
Cash is
so I think that's the big thing.
Game changer.
Now let's jump to finish things off, these short, fast questions. The first one that I couldn't help but think about was your morning routine. What does it look like?
Routine. Well, I set the alarm usually for 5. And sometimes I'll press the snooze button once, but sometimes I have been known to press it up to an hour and a half. I get up, I usually meditate in the mornings for 20, 30 minutes. And
what type of meditation? Like mindfulness?
Mindfulness, yeah, just sitting quietly without any sound, except the birds.
Okay.
And then I'll drink lots of warm lemon juice, and then I'll write. I find that the best time of the day, fresh usually.
And how long do you normally write for?
Until Lara gets up.
And what time does she normally get up?
Usually about 7:30.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
evening, how do you sort of decompress at night?
Evening, well, I used to do it the other way around. I used to write at night, but I was finding I could not sleep because I couldn't switch my brain off. And I'd be there at 3 o'clock going, oh, that's right, I should write that down because I'll never remember in the morning. So now I go to bed pretty early, and I am an avid reader. I love reading.
Yeah.
Love it. So that's my reading time.
Okay. And if you had to gift a book to the audience, would it be that Sex Sells book that you were talking about?
Oh, depends which audience.
Yeah,
the audience for my book.
Yeah. Well, if you were to, I ask each guest a book other than their own that they'd recommend for Christmas.
For Christmas. Well, the book that I was gifted was The Art of Happiness.
Okay.
And it's a guy, I can't remember his name, which is terrible. I'm terrible at recall. But it was a guy who interviewed the Dalai Lama and what his opinion on happiness was.
I feel like I got this book on my book list. I got a book list about 70 books long. I read probably an hour every night, so I probably cover about a book every 2 weeks on average. Actually behind me on this bookshelf, the ones that I haven't read are sort of sitting horizontally.
Too many?
Yeah, a little bit too many because I buy them in bulk and I prefer. That's an interesting thing. Do you read on Kindle or do you like a hard copy book?
I used to like hard copy, and then I went on a big road trip once, which of course I couldn't take lots of books, and now I am just, I read a lot through the library app.
Okay.
I'll find a good author, and then I'll go and read every single book that the writer has
ever written. Like iPad?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. How do you find reading on that? Because that's the dilemma I'm stuck with at the moment. I still like the physical feeling of the books, and you're one of a few guests that in the last few weeks I've had this discussion with. And I feel like I'm moving more and more towards getting the Kindle, but I don't know, I just still like that feeling of the book.
I do feel like a bit of a traitor as a writer, that I should be holding this book, but I find it easy with the light. I can sit there with the light on, I can read in bed. And I can just carry it around with me. Everything's contained. 1 million books is contained in this one device, despite the fact that I don't want my daughter to go anywhere near the device.
Okay.
That's tricky.
What have you done with that? That's an interesting one. You won't let her have a device until how old?
18. She goes to a Steiner school. So
good luck with that.
Yeah,
good luck with that.
I know.
She'll find one, don't worry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, I was having this discussion with my cousin recently, because their kids have got. Do they have an iPad or a Nintendo? And I used to think, because we used to love playing Nintendo as kids, but I don't know. Like, I know my dad restricted us using it for sure. We had an hour every day and that was it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's tricky. It's an addiction.
It really
it's
is.
Hard. It's
yeah,
really
we were
hard.
just saying in our last episode published the other week, it was sort of episode 100 year in review, and we were talking about this phone addiction thing. I've completely changed the way that I use my phone in the last about 3 months ago, and it's had a dramatic impact to the point that, you know, your message before when you're in the cafe, I just don't see that stuff.
Right.
Like, I only saw that as you were going to park your car and coming back because I just don't have any notification. The only notification I have is when people call me, and that's it. And then I know I need to respond. But apart from that, I can't be interrupted at all during the day until I check
I think
something.
it's a good way of managing it.
It's brilliant because what happened was in the first, let's say, month, I would still go back and check maybe every 2 hours, or let's say 3 hours. But now I can forget all day and not check my messages at all, which for me, as an extroverted person, I would not have expected.
Yeah.
But it's amazing. I don't care. Like, if someone really needs to speak to me, they'll call me. And if I really want to catch up with someone, I'll call them or message them and get something booked in, and I'll do it. So,
like the old days.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. I completely agree. I just think they're very addictive devices.
Yeah. Agreed.
If you could have a billboard anywhere in Australia, where would it be? And then what would it say?
I'd say a billboard, Parliament House.
Okay.
That says...
Just down the front?
that says sorry. Sorry to all the donor-conceived adults out there that have been through grief and trauma, the anonymity which in the past occurred in Australia, for the grief that a lot of people are still going through, and that, you know, we're trying to catch up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good approach. It's going to be, look, like I said before, I think things have been a bit, as you said, archaic in the past, but in the next decade it'll be interesting to see how this area changes.
I think donor-conceived people are running these organisations, and they'll be, you know...
But the fact that you're writing this book, like, are there many books? I don't think there would be many books like this, would there? At least for Australia.
There's nothing that gives the whole end-to-end thing. So there's information on various websites, there's blogs, there's international stuff which doesn't necessarily relate to Australians, but there's nothing end-to-end that tells you all about the options, how to choose, the legislation, and ongoing. Because I originally was calling it choosing a sperm donor, but I thought that's so limiting. No, it's about egg donors and embryo donors, and it's not just about conception. It's about what happens after that as well. So it doesn't stop there. Just because you've conceived a child.
Yeah, it's just part one.
You've got to manage this. Not only do you have to manage the child, but you've also got to manage this donor conception thing.
Yeah.
Ongoing.
Yeah, I think that mindset is what is changing the most that I've noticed. Look, thank you so much for joining us. We've already cracked an hour and 20. So, and I know you've got a car parked and I don't want to take up too much longer, but thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Where can people find your blog, you on social media, so they can keep on track of this book that will be published later this year?
I've got a website which is called donorconceptionandbeyond.com.au.
Yeah.
And I have a website. A Facebook page. Which is also called Donor Conception and Beyond.
Okay. Make sure we link both.
I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Do you tweet much?
Just my blogs, really. I'm just kind of warming up to Twitter. How excited I am about it.
If you were to choose one social media platform, what's the one that you use the most?
Facebook.
Because
a lot of these groups are on Facebook.
Okay.
Where people converse and share.
Okay. Right, well, we'll make sure we link that. Like I said, thanks for coming on. I'm glad Eileen introduced us. It's been very interesting learning about this area, so thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers. Thank you for making it to the end. Before you run off, we need your help to grow this audience. Subscribe on your podcast app. Subscribing will give you priority access and help your fellow-minded listeners find Uncommon, or consider sharing this with a friend who you think would enjoy these sorts of episodes, and this will go a very, very long way in helping us build the audience. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and Twitter, or consider subscribing on YouTube as well. You just need to search for Neural, Neuralle, or consider following us on Instagram as well by searching Uncommon, UNCOMMON. But until next time, thank you so much for listening.